a second, Tom? You're good? Okay.
We're rolling? We're rolling? Tom, in 1973, I think, and your memory for dates and names is much better than mine, but I understand finally you were hired by the network to move out east, to work on Nightly with John Chancellor and David Brinkley. Could you talk about how that came to pass?
Well, the courtship began really earlier than that. In '68, I was at the conventions in Chicago and in Miami. I'd been covering politics out there. I covered Bobby Kennedy's last campaign in Los Angeles. So I was on the air a fair amount for the network. And then, because I kind of developed this reputation of being an almanac for California politics, our correspondents would come through and I would brief them, Sandy Van Oker and others. I even briefed David Brinkley. Actually, I'll tell you this story. My first year in Los Angeles, I was all over the Reagan campaign, got to know him well, got to know what it was, and then I get a call and they said, Brinkley's coming out to cover the Reagan campaign. We want you to brief him. I almost fainted. I thought, I'm not, me, brief David, I'm 26 years, David Brinkley? Come on. So I put together a big reel, and David came, and he was very cordial. And we sat in this room, and then I showed him stuff, and I would talk to him about how he had changed. One of the things that I said was that he used to show up in a pair of slacks and a sports jacket and loafers, and then they decided he needed to be more of a kind of businessman, so they put him in a blue suit with lace-up shoes and serious things. I was riffing as I was looking at all this stuff. And David said to me at one point, can I say shit on this interview? David said, is he a shit? And I said, no, but he is aloof. I mean, he was not easy to be around strangers. And that was really true. Even the people who worked for him said that. He had kind of a distance until he got in front of a crowd, then he was engaging and gregarious. So I take him through the whole reel. And David said, thank you very much. And I said to him, gee, that was really exciting for him. I don't know whether it did him any good or not, but I get this brief. So I turn in and Huntley Brinkley, and David comes on and says, Ronald Reagan, who used to be seen around here in a sports jacket and loafers, now is dressed in a blue suit. Oh my God, what else did I say? And it was actually the beginning of a great relationship with David. We really got along well. I think he was impressed with how much I knew at that point and knew I had an eye for detail that he would like to pick up on. So I'm now covering politics a lot, the Bobby McCarthy race and other things that were going on in California politics. Very, very rich time. The SDS was very active. And I remember I went to Jane Fonda's first news conference at the LA Press Club. And I was very, very skeptical. She shows up in a fatigue jacket, no makeup, hair down, and the whole thing. Come on. This is the anti-war movement, Jane Fonda. And my cameraman looked at her, and then he looked at her through the lens, and he said, oh my God, come here. So I said, well, he said, look at her. Now look at her through the lens. The transformation was astonishing. All the bone structure, all the great beauty of her isolated in that lens. Just, you saw why she was such a huge star on the big screen. Now, didn't handle herself particularly well. She was mostly angry at that point. But I knew Tom Hayden. I was covering that part of it and covering the Senate races as well. Made a lot of friends in those days. And then I went again, the next convention I was off again. I was in Miami for the Republicans where I had a lot of contacts. And then they began to say, John Chancellor used to say, you got to come east to be a grown-up, Tom. I said, I'm a grown-up in California. I like California. We were building a house on the beach, took every dime we had and wherever we could borrow. My wife had a real reputation, not just standing as who she was, but she was doing logistics. One of our close friends was Cokie Roberts, and Meredith and Cokie were both raising children and pursuing their careers. It was an exciting time to be there. And they came and said, you got to come east. and it was the summer of '73. And I said, oh, God, I don't know. And Watergate was underway, and Dan Rather for CBS had a big head of steam at the White House. They said, well, would you go to London? I said, I'll go to London. I can sell that. I'll go to London. Called me the next day and said, we lied. You can't go to London. You got to come to the White House. I said, okay, I should do this. And so I went home with the hardest conversation I'd ever had with Meredith about the move, because he didn't. I said, we got to do this, honey. This is going to be really exciting. And we had just moved into the beach house. And so I went back, started working in Washington early in the summer of '73. Meredith came from the cool beaches of Southern California, this postmodern house, and all of her friends into Washington in August, in the heat of the summer. August, as you know, in Washington, people have vacated the place. There was nobody around because they're all up in the vineyard or somewhere else. And the housing was terrible. You couldn't find a house that we could, A, afford, and B, that a neighborhood we wanted to live in. And when I got to her, she was not very happy. I had a great guy in NBC in Burbank in those days who took care of Meredith and me. He was a retired Army colonel, and they didn't have children. They kind of adopted us, and he put in my contract that I could take Meredith with me to New York on weekends whenever I wanted to, because I was doing the weekend news. So I exercised it, and I said, we're going to New York for the weekend. We're going to stay at the Plaza, and then we're going to go see a show, and we're going to do this up. And so we got on an Eastern Airlines plane with a lot of sweaty bureaucrats, and they were smoking, because you could in those days. Well, we came from California, which is the health store, environment. So she's looking around, what have I gotten myself into here? And we got to New York, went to the Plaza, and walked into the Plaza tea room where there was a cellist playing and it was serving things. It was air conditioning. She looked at me and said, well, maybe. And then that was the beginning of our move to the East.
So you're now White House correspondent for NBC News in the summer of '73 in the fall, and Watergate is heating up. Could you talk to us about covering Watergate?
Well, I'm writing about it, actually, the last year of Nixon from '73 to '74. You remember that I get there in August, but the lead up to that had been the hearings, and Ehrlichman and Haldeman were fired by the president. John Mitchell was in great trouble. Woodward and Bernstein were breaking one exclusive after another every day, and it looked like it was all going downhill. And Nixon went to San Clemente, where I then went out there with that, and Kissinger was named Secretary of State, and the president gave a national speech in which he said, in effect, we got to put Watergate behind us. I take responsibility, but I had nothing to do with all of this. And by then he'd fired. So it was a politically pregnant moment going into the fall of '73. I arrive in Washington full time, and we began to hear that Agnew's got some kind of difficulty. And that was completely unexpected. So I went down to the old EOB, and Agnew gave this defiant news conference. And honestly, I looked at the reviews later. Washington Post, the Boston Globe, the New York Times, he was a stand-up guy. He spoke, candidly. He answered the questions. There's something to be said for that. Well, he was guilty as hell, it turns out. So that was the first thing that happened. And then they had to find a replacement for him. And it was Jerry Ford. And so we're in the middle of all that. Here's what a lot of people don't remember. October was one of the most tumultuous months in the history of the modern presidency. Nixon is now feeling pretty comfortable because he's given a couple of speeches that have gone reasonably well. Syria and Egypt invade Israel, and Israel is in peril. It may go down. It was that serious. And the Israelis say to Nixon, we need all the help you can muster. And this was the good Nixon. He knew what to do. He was a national security guy. And with Henry Kissinger, they put the pressure on the Pentagon, and they said, Nixon's phrase, send all the goddamn airplanes we have loaded up with stuff. And they couldn't fly over Europe. They had to fly around the Azores to get the stuff into Israel, and Israel prevailed. But it went on for a month. Israel lost 2,500 people in that war. We were so preoccupied here that we were looking not as much at that. If you go back and look at the New York Times banners in those days, there would be 3 tiers. It would be the war, it would be Watergate, and then it would be Agnew. I mean, it was an unbelievably fertile time. And I was pedaling as hard as I could. In a way, as a newcomer, it was an advantage for me because the news was there. All you had to do was be able to put it in some kind of a form, which I was able to do. And as I've said since then, the difference between then and now is that at 7 o'clock at night after the nightly news, I'd get on the phone and start working for the Today Show the next morning. I didn't have to go on Chris Matthews, or I didn't have to go on one of the cable shows and answer questions about is he guilty or is he not guilty or do all the speculation. I was just dealing with what I was dealing with. And it was instructive to me. And the other thing I did when I got to Washington, even though I'd been in there, I decided to go see the principals. And my friends and colleagues said, you know, you just deal with the staff. I said, no, I want them to know who I am. So I went to see Elliot Richardson in his office. I went to see all the cabinet officers, and I went to the Hill, and I met Bill Fulbright at that time and Mike Mansfield at that time. And when I would be then in the crowd, they would acknowledge me, and they knew who I was. And the great moment for me was that, there were a couple of them, but one of them was that Ken Clausen was the kind of a thuggish guy who worked for Nixon, and he thought I was a pretty boy from California, and I was holding my own. And one day, George Meany took after the president, so they wanted Pat Buchanan to respond to him. And Clausen said, I can give you Buchanan exclusively. Well, I mean, it was Pat. I liked Pat, by the way. And so I went over to the interview with Pat, answering me, and I said, I need to call the office. Well, you can use that office in there. So I go in this office, and on the desk was a piece of paper. And the paper said, I'm not going to tell you who signed it because I've always felt bad that he got stuck with it. The paper said, I've been in touch with National Association of Manufacturers, the American Banking Association, and one other group. They'll call the president right after his speech, which was scheduled, and tell him what a wonderful job he did and how they're behind him. Nixon had promised that that practice would come to an end, that he had said, no, we're not doing that anymore. The White House said, no, that's the wrong thing. Here they were, starting it up again. I think I'm being teed up. So I memorized the memo, and I dial till I get the memo memorized. I go back to the White House, and I call the National Association of Manufacturers, and I said, hey, it's Brokaw at the White House. You all set for tonight? Oh, yeah, we've got the number. We'll call, and we'll make sure all of our people call. Thank you very much. Hang on. Then I go on the air that night and said, the White House had promised that they were not going to do this contrived response to his speech, but they were already been in touch. Well, the place blew up again, and Clausen was furious with me, but he never called me a California pretty boy again after that. And I met Pat, and we had some laughs about it. So the other part of that story is that it was the Radio and Television Correspondence Center was the big deal in those days, bigger than the White House Correspondence Center has become. And I was taking Pat as my guest, and he had just taken the head off the networks at that point. So I walked into the NBC cocktail party, told Pat to stay outside, and I said to Julian Goodman, Pat Buchanan, he said, so I went out and said, Pat, we better go find another place to have a drink. This is not going to work. We sat down at the table, and I looked up, and the senator from Michigan was Phil Hart, who was a revered figure in Washington. I had not met him, didn't know him. And he was smiling at me. He said, Mr. Brokaw, how old are you? And I said, I'm 33. And he said, that's just great. That's just great. It made a big impression on me. Later, I wrote about him because I didn't know at the time. He was one of the heroes of D-Day. And when he came back wounded, he was put in a hospital room with Danny Inouye and with Bob Dole. The three of them had never met each other. And they shared this room for 3 months. And they talked about what they wanted to do with their lives, and they decided that public service would be their calling. And it was one of those defining moments for me about the greatest generation. Phil and Danny became Democrats. Bob Dole became a Republican, but they were like that for the rest of their careers. And it made a big impression on a lot of people. It turns out that Phil Hart had got a Silver Star, that he was a lieutenant colonel, he'd been wounded on D-Day. It was unbelievable stuff. So every time I go by the Hart office building.
Did you ever, speaking of meeting the principals, did you ever meet President Nixon?
I did. I did. He knew who I was, and but he was not a meet and greet guy, you know. And they had him hidden pretty much. He didn't deal with him a lot. But they had a reception, and they brought in local news people as well. And Meredith and I were in line for the reception, and I knew that Nixon hated those things. So Herb Klein, who was his longtime friend from San Diego, a lovely guy, former newspaper man, sees Meredith and me in the line. He comes over and says, "Oh, God, I'm so glad you're here to talk to the president. And what's going on?" I said, "Well, we've been building a house down on the beach in Venice." "Oh, great." So we get up there, and Herb says to the president, "You remember Tom?" "Oh, of course. You know, and you know, they're building a house in Venice." The president says, "Really? What's beachfront going for now in Venice? And do you have an ocean view or not?" I mean, the house. I mean, it was all real estate. I mean, I'd always heard that he was fascinated by money and how you get it, what it was worth. I said, "Well, it's pretty dear, Mr. President, but we're doing the best we can." And I moved on. He wanted to talk real estate with me.
In, I think it was around 1976, you moved from being White House correspondent to daytime television, moved over to the Today Show. How did that come to pass? And
well, they'd come to me when Frank McGee died. They asked me. I was part of the tryout crowd, and I had a good week. And it was kind of by consensus that they thought I should do it. And they came to me and said, "We want you to do it." But in those days, people forget this. The Today Show host had to do the commercials. And you know, it was Alpo and you know, a lot of cheesy stuff. But I said, "No, I'm not going to do that. I'm in the middle of the biggest story in American politics. I'm not leaving the White House. I'm just not going to do it." And they said, "Do you know how much this is going to pay you?" And I said, "I do. But I'm not leaving. I'm going to stay." I told a friend later that the following week after I turned him down, they named Jim Hart was a good guy to be the choice. I was in Los Angeles, and I was in a helicopter getting to the airport, and I was flying over a Tony part of the San Fernando Valley, and every house had a beautiful swimming pool. And I thought, maybe I could have had that. But it was an easy call for me. I was not inclined to do that. I wanted to stay with Watergate.
But eventually you did it.
Eventually I did. That was, they said no reading of commercials, you know, you can help redefine it. I had been through the greatest story the White House could possibly produce. I liked Jerry Ford to cover. Things were changing. So I thought, and they also said, "We want you to..."
Hold on one second.
So part of the deal with me accepting the Today Show was that I didn't have to give up my political reporting. I covered all the conventions and the primaries when I got there. And I did foreign trips as well.
Sorry, they're still going. Let me just...
Well, they said to me, "We've got to do the Today Show because we need you to do that. If we want you to do nightly news at some point, and to get in line for that, you have to do that. You have to help us with this." And I said, "Okay." And I was intrigued by living in New York, and the Today Show had cultural range that I liked, that I was interested in, the books, the theater, that kind of stuff. And it was old-fashioned in those days, too old-fashioned it turns out, because it had for years been, had no competition in the mornings. They could do whatever they wanted to do. And when I arrived, they were still putting harpsichordists on at 7:20 in the morning in gold brocade dresses. I mean, it's just, wait a minute, folks. So we had to start changing that. And the ABC had, David Hartman was a great guy, and he was doing Good Morning America. And they caught us and went by us at one point after I'd been there about two years, I guess. And we brought in a different producer by the name of Steve Friedman, who is from Chicago, and I'd known him in L.A., and he was a modern television guy. And he said to me, he called me Prince, the Prince of News. He said, Prince, we're going to work you to death, but he said it's going to pay off. So the conventions of 70, of 80 of Ronald Reagan, I covered all the primaries for the Today Show, early in the morning and then late at night, and I raced to whatever the next place. We were all over the conventions, and we caught and went by ABC that year and stayed ahead of them by being live and being, doing it. And the greatest show I had ever done on live television to this day was the wedding of Charles and Diana. That was not the thing that I did, but we had Steve doing this. We had a position right at the Canada Gate looking at Buckingham Palace. Nobody else had that position that we did. We had aggressive producers, so we had Richard Burton on, and we had everybody that we wanted came on. And after 2 days, they all wanted to be on the Today Show because it was such a hot ticket at that point. And I must say, I had a great time. Because it was a no-brainer. Just let the pictures tell the story. And Charles and Diana were. I was having dinner every night with some women who were friends of mine from here, and they were plugged in to the circle. And the other thing that we did is that we found this woman who we thought might be able to help us some, and it was Tina Brown. She was doing the Tatler at the time. And she often tells a story. We had dinner, we got along well, and the next day, right before we went on the air, I said to her, not to worry about anything, it'd be the largest television audience in the history of morning television. Oh, God. And then she said, moments later, Diana appeared, and you were describing her, and then you said, my God, look at those feet, they're as large as gunboats, her shoes are. She said, I knew then I could say anything that I wanted to. So we just rocked and rolled for an entire 4 or 5 days. And it was joyous. We got off the air. We were on the air midday because of the time difference. Got off the air in time to go to parties and go to dinner at night. And I would go with these women who were the, not courtesans, but they were the great observers of what was going on. They had all this inside stuff. And they immediately said to me, it'll never work. It's an arranged marriage. Charles has got a girlfriend. It's not gonna work. I mean, that was the first kind of inkling I had of that. And then Burton called. I didn't know him, but he wanted to be on the air with me because I've been watching you. I want to be a part of this. Michael Caine called. And he said, how do I get in on this? And Carrie DeTan, what's her name? Carrie the opera singer. She's the Kiwi. She sang, I'll name it. Anyhow, I don't have it right. Anyhow.
She came on.
Huh?
Did she come on?
Yeah, she sang at the wedding.
Yeah.
And I said to her, if you can get to our place, we'll put you on the air. And I looked out, and she was being handed by the crowd, hand over hand over hand, to get us onto the stage with us. Carrie DeTanawa. What is her name? Can you Google that?
I'm looking at now. Carrie Kanawa.
Carrie DeTanawa.
Yeah, right. And Carrie DeTanawa, right.
Yeah.
And the big performance at the wedding itself, and I had said to her, if you can come and we'll put you on the air. And she arrived with this enormous hat, and she was being handed by the crowd. She was absolutely horizontal, handed by the crowd, one over the other, and is deposited on the stage. And she was glorious. I've seen her once since then, which was like 15 years later, and I walked into her dressing room unexpectedly. She was doing something at NBC. She said, oh, Thomas. I said, the time of my life. We both have the same great memory about it.
By 1982, it sounds like you had paid your dues and you were appointed as the anchor, or perhaps for the first year co-anchor with Roger Mudd of Nightly News. Tell us how that came to pass.
Well, there had been a big change in our. Bill Small had come over to NBC. He was a CBS guy. He was angry about how he had been forced out at CBS. And he brought a bunch of CBS people with him, including Roger Mudd and the Kell brothers and others. And I had really been promised by the NBC group that I would be the anchor of the NBC Nightly News. Turns out that Bill had offered the job to Roger and not had told anybody. And he wanted me to stay. And I finally had to say to him, Bill, did you offer this job to Roger? And he said to me, no, I can't remember. I said, come on, did you or not? And he said, yes, I did. Roger called me to his credit and said, I don't want to live in New York. I'd be willing to share this with you. I'll stay in Washington, you be in New York. And I was going to go to ABC. Roone Arledge had really, really recruited me hard. I mean, and Roone was unbelievably persuasive. It wasn't automatically I was going to be the anchor of the ABC News, but it was clear that that's what he was talking about. And CBS made me a great offer. I mean, I'd never been in a place like that before, but Roone was the one that I thought I would go to work for. I liked him. I liked what he was doing with television news. But I was a lifer at NBC, and I had all these colleagues who were looking at me with kind of long expressions because if I left, they were left in the hands of the new CBS crowd. And I decided to stay. I was always grateful to Roger for giving me that opportunity. As a team, we didn't work particularly well. It was not well produced, and we didn't have it sorted out. And so the affiliates were pushing back hard. And Reuben Frank had to make a decision, and he decided that I should be the correspondent. It was very, very hard for Roger, and it was understandable. I felt bad because I'm a big admirer of his skill set.
And did that adversely impact your relationship with?
Well, it went on.
Did it hurt your relationship, your friendship with Roger, that you were chosen?
I think it did. I don't think. I think I've talked to him once since, and I wrote him a note when I left Nightly News, kind of at the apogee of my career, and I said it wouldn't have happened without you, Roger. Our kids were friends, and he's talked to my daughters, but I think he was deeply wounded by it. He'd lost the job at CBS to Dan, and then he didn't get picked to be my successor. But Roger had a very personally defined idea of what an anchorman ought to be. And the world was changing. I mean, he had to be able to travel. You know, he had to jump on the airplane with the crews, with the mobile stuff, and go to the war zone, and go to wherever it was. He liked staying where he was in Washington. And if there had been an hour nightly news, you could have used Roger as the great, great voice of journalism in Washington. A man who kind of be the inside thing. But we didn't have that. The world had changed. The world meant that you had to be what Dan became and what Peter became, what I became. You know, we were guys fast on our feet who get on airplanes with the new mobile equipment and go to China and go to the Middle East and go to wherever all hell was breaking loose and do it from there. So it's too bad.
Talk about, expand and talk about your view of the role of an anchor of a major television network.
Well, it changed in those days because we became mobile reporters more than just Mount Rushmore figures in a studio somewhere.
Newsreaders.
Yeah, what we did was, I remember, here's a perfect example. I had a source of the South African government that was very helpful to me about what was going on. He called me on a Monday morning, and he said, and we'd been hearing about Mandela's baby released at some point, we didn't know. And my source said, come right now. And I said, I need more than that. He said, let me call you back in a half an hour, but I think you should come right now. So he called me back and said, come right now. So I had a backpack. I ran by our apartment in New York. We had a booking on the Concorde, and I flew to Paris, changed airplanes, and flew directly to South Africa. That's what you had to do in those days. Got off the plane in South Africa, and our bureau chief said, mate, you've come a long way. It's not going to happen. And I said, God, this guy is golden. And she said, it's not going to happen. I went down to Cape Town, and I interviewed the foreign minister of South Africa, and he was very coy with me, but he didn't confirm anything. The tape had a little wrinkle in it. So I had to go back and interview him again. By then, he'd had a few drinks, and he said to me, "Mr. Brokaw, your country is going to be very happy with my government in the next 24 hours." Oh, it is going to happen. At 3 o'clock the following morning, they called from New York and said, "You got lucky again. He's going to be released in 5 hours. Get up and go." One of the defining moments of my career was being in the square in Cape Town when this elegant man stepped out onto the balcony, and the crowd went crazy. And he was so dignified. It looked like he'd just come back from a business trip in Geneva. Beautifully turned out, charismatic. He came from royalty, as you know, and the tribal royalty in South Africa. And he talked about his hopes for South Africa. And then we all raced back to Joburg, and he was going back to his home in Soweto. And early the next morning, I'm there in his garden with him. It was, again, as if he had just gotten out of the car from a trip to town. He was easy, and our camera crews were thrilled. And the sound man put the microphone over on his sound. The microphone had a big sound reducer on it, a big fuzzy thing. And I said, "Mr. Mandela, it's not a weapon, it's a microphone." And he looked at me and he said, "Well, at first I didn't know. Maybe I've gotten into bigger trouble than I realized here." And just then, a friend of mine took the picture of the two of us, and we were both laughing. And it's a black and white photograph, and I keep it above my wife keeps it above her desk. It's one of my favorite photographs. He was so charming, intellectual, philosophical, winning, everything you wanted him to be, he was. And by then, I was not an easy sell, but I was so taken with him. It was one of the best stories I was ever involved in.
You've had the opportunity to talk to many other key personalities, newsmakers, and so forth. And I'd like to ask you about a few of them. You were the first American correspondent to interview President Gorbachev. Could you talk about that, how that interview came about, and what your recollection of it is?
Well, the Gorbachev interview was the hot ticket in our business. Everybody wanted the first interview with him. Dan was trying hard. Peter was trying hard. I had a great colleague by the name of Gordon Manning, an old-fashioned newspaper man who was just beloved by everybody in the business, who was never out of energy, never out of ideas, and he had a friend from earlier dealings in the Gorbachev circle, and he just was working him. And we got the interview because it was Gordon who got the interview for us. And I went to Moscow. My only disappointment is that Gorbachev, we had only 1 hour, beginning to finish, and Gorbachev opened with a screed about the United States, and he was eating up our time, and my thought was, do I now take him on with that? It might have been a good idea, but I needed the time to get at what was going on in Russia. So the interview did get very good reviews, although Sapphire gave me some grief about it. And I said, "Bill, I had to make a quick decision, and maybe it was wrong, but we heard from him what we needed to hear about what was going on there." And as a result of that interview, Gorbachev thought of me as the only American correspondent that really counted for the rest of his career, which I loved, because I would be somewhere and he would pick me out of the crowd, and he came to New York with Raisa, and I put together a little group, and we had an evening at the Waldorf with him, and he's a truly important historic figure, and history will treat him well, I think.
There was another Russian leader. I believe you also were the first American correspondent to interview Vladimir Putin. Could you tell us how that interview came to pass and your impressions of it?
Putin was a different cat. He was a former KGB agent. He was not happy about being interviewed by me. He has not been in office very long, and we barely got on the air that night because his meetings were running over, and I think he was trying to put me in my place, so to speak, and he was not very responsive to what was going on. I'm not sure that we knew at that point, which he later acknowledged, that the night the Berlin Wall came down, he wept as a KGB agent. It was the destruction of the Russia that he had grown up with and had been protective of. He was canny. He was a better political figure than we expected him to be, frankly. You know, he had been a KGB agent in St. Petersburg and then also, but he obviously had his eye on what he became. And then I interviewed him as well in this country, and I had a dinner for him at 21 Club one night. And I had people who served in Russia, like David Remnick, for example, and Bob Kaiser from the Washington Post, and others who were familiar with that. And then I brought in Katie Couric and Diane Sawyer and other people as well.
Let's just...
So Putin's first trip to the United Nations, I got in touch with the staff and said I'd like to have a dinner for him with American correspondents. I don't think that staff survived, probably. They thought it was a great idea. I think they all got fired because he was not very happy. And we served bison at the 21 Club. And I tried to make it a very American dinner, and I had David Remnick, who had served in Moscow, and Bob Kaiser, who had been there as well. And then our other political reporters, and Diane Sawyer, I was very ecumenical about it, and Katie Couric came. Maureen Dowd came as well. Maureen Orth, who had just been in Moscow doing reporting on the economic corruption that was going on. A very, very lively evening. He said he could only stay for an hour. He ended up staying for about 3 hours, and it was all boom, 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 like this. And I think it's then that we knew what we were in for. There was no attempt to be cordial or, you know, to try to please us on kind of protocol grounds at all.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned the Berlin Wall and President Putin, now President Putin's reaction to it. But you were also in Berlin when the wall came down in 1989. Could you talk about your experience in Berlin, excuse me, watching, covering the fall of the Berlin Wall?
Well, the fall of the Berlin Wall was one of the defining moments in my career. And I wish I could say I was prescient. I knew it was going to happen. That's why I went. That did not happen that way. Jerry Lamprecht was our foreign corps director of news, and he came to me on a Monday or Tuesday, and he said, not much going on here. You know, a lot of turmoil in Berlin. They're going out through Czechoslovakia. Why don't you go over there and do a couple of days and then come back? And I said, yeah, that's a good idea. So I actually had lunch with Dick Holbrook, a well-known American gadfly, but also a really astute guy when it came to, you know, foreign developments. And he said, oh, that's a great idea. So I flew that night. And the next day, we made all kinds of arrangements in case things happened. We had a live crane with a camera. I could do a satellite feed. And we'd made arrangements. We had a good bureau in Berlin. But it was so slow the next day, I said, I'm only going to do half the show here tonight because there's not enough to fill it. I was able to go back and forth at Checkpoint Charlie in a way that we'd never been able to before. And the guards were kind of motioning us through, but there was no anticipation. And the second day, we asked for an interview with Gunnar Schabowski, who was the propaganda chief of East Berlin. And late in the afternoon, just as a routine kind of thing.
Hold on. Pick up. Okay, pick up with Minister Schabowski.
Oh, okay. Anyhow, the second day that I was there, we asked for an interview with Gunnar Schabowski, who was the propaganda chief of the East German Politburo. He was going to have a news conference at 5 o'clock in the afternoon, Berlin time. And things were rumbling around, but there was no anticipation that was going to. So I go, and I'm about half asleep because I'd been up for 2 days at that point. My camera crew, German nationals who I'd worked with forever, they'd been there from the beginning of the Cold War. And then what I remember vividly is that in the room, the East German journalists were suddenly emboldened. They were asking him questions that they never would have before. And he was deflecting them and saying, oh, we're going to work this all out. And about halfway through the news conference, somebody hands him a piece of paper. And the paper, he reads it and he says, oh, the East German Politburo has decided that members of the GDR can exit the GDR and return through the same gates without the visas that they need, or something like that. And it was like lightning had struck the room. I turned to my German camera crew and they were shaking their head. And the AP guy who had been dozing off said, my God, I think the wall is going to come down. And Schabowski said, well, that's the ruling of the Politburo, and got up and left the stage, went upstairs where I had the interview with him. And I had this wonderful woman who threw her body against the door to hold off the other correspondents trying to get into the room. And I said, take out that piece of paper again, Mr. Schabowski, and read it to me. And he did, and I said, does that mean that members of the GDR can come and go through the wall at will? Or words to that effect. He said, that's what it means. And then I began to query him about how he felt as a lifelong communist about what had gone on there. And he said, I'm still a communist. And I said, do you think you made wrong decisions? Well, we're trying to do the best we can to cope with this. I leave his office. I go downstairs, and some of my print pals are there on the landing, and they're reading. And they're trying to figure out what the hell does this mean. And I said, it's down. The wall is coming down. I just was with him. He said it means exactly what he said it meant. So, I think this is the real deal. I went out and called New York. Went on the air with Gary Cutler, who spent a lot of time in Germany. He was very familiar with it all. I was doing live stuff. And then we had we'd ordered a boom, thank God, at the Brandenburg Gate where we had the live setup. And that all got arranged in a hurry. I went back to the office and started working on this. Went out to Brandenburg Gate at about 5:30, 5:45 New York time. And the wall was covered with students from the West who had gone up on top of the wall and were saying to the students on the other side, come on, come on. And the students on the other side were persuaded they'd be shot if they did that, because the political police were all over the place, and then they started hosing off the Westerners from the eastern side. And there was a wonderful moment because they hosed them off one point, and one guy stayed, turned his back to him all. He had a leather jacket, his arms outstretched, big grin on his face, and they were trying to drive him off the wall. And I said to Martin Fletcher, one of my colleagues, go over and get him. He'll be on the cover of Time magazine next week. The new German. The new German. And he comes back running over to me, and Martin says, not what we think. And I said, what do you mean it's not what we think? He said, he's a drunk who's been living over here in the forest. This is his first shower in about 3 weeks. That's all he's interested in. Anyhow, we still don't have footage of them coming through the wall anywhere. And one of our cameramen was at Hofstra Gate, where the first people started to come across. And he ran about 2 miles with his camera, with his video cassette. Said, here it is, they're down. It was like 5 minutes to go. And we put it in, and I came on the air that night. And I said to New York, to the Cheryl Gould, who was in the control room, and others, just stay with me. There's no way I can do a script. I'm going to ad-lib my way for the next half an hour. Just stay with me. And so they did. And it was another one of those cases where I really never looked at my entire performance, but my friends, Martin Fletchers and others, have said, maybe your best night ever. You did the whole broadcast off the top of your head, and then I did an essay at the end saying that I thought that 1968 was a defining year of my political of my journalistic career, but never anything like this has happened in our lifetime, because this is effectively the unwinding of the Soviet Union. The wall is down. Change has come to our world in ways we could not have anticipated. These Germans who've been living over there are now free to come and go, and it's going to have a profound effect in when I like that. And we stayed on the air a long time, got up early the next morning, went to the wall, and it was a scene unlike anything I'd ever seen. One of my favorite stories was on the west side of the wall, there was a man who had an apartment who looked out over the wall, in effect, to a East German tailor who was working at his sewing machine every morning, and they would kind of wave at each other. Been going on for 30 years, and they never talked. And they had a reunion the next morning. I mean, think about that, you know. And the East Germans came over in their cheap denim outfits and fake fur jackets and the Ladas, the little two-cycle cars that were belching all kinds of smoke. And they were driving down the Kurfürstendamm, a great shopping road in Berlin, filled with Mercedes and with, Parisian fashions and elegant lighting. And the West Germans had their babies in proms that they would be pushing along. And these, one part of the German population was living on Earth, the other population was living on Mars. And the people from Mars were coming to Earth for the first time, is the only way to describe it.
Around the same time period in 1989, you were in China, in Tiananmen Square, and covering the events in China at that time. And I recall a wonderful story of your coverage, how you got video footage of what was going on in Tiananmen Square in Beijing and elsewhere. I wonder if you could recall that story for us.
I'd been in China twice. I did an early documentary with a British crew about changing China when they were just beginning to emerge, but it was still quite a primitive place. But I was all over the country, so I was familiar with it. And I actually had Chinese friends who were scholars and others. And then we went back again to do a thing called Changing China. And then Tiananmen blew up. And I was in New York. I had been there the week before for the Gorbachev visit and then came home. And then when it blew up, I remember thinking, should I go or not go? And I thought, I've got to go. My rule was, it's always a mistake not to go. So I went. And I got there, I'll never forget it, I got to Tokyo and I couldn't get into China. And they had a wonderful Filipino airport manager in Tokyo. He knew all the planes that were going in, and he said, I think I'll be able to get you on one. I said, I know what I'll do. I'll call Secretary of State Jim Baker in Washington, see if I can't get in on an American plane. And I called his assistant, Margaret Tutwiler. I don't think it's going to work, Tom, but I'll call you back. And about 20 minutes later, she said, the secretary says, no way, you're not going in on an American plane. They didn't want to screw with us. So in the meantime, I got about an hour's sleep, and the airport manager in Tokyo said, I found a Canadian plane that's resupplying their embassy. We're going to put you on that. Just don't say anything. You're just going to be on it. So I arrived, and I'd been in Beijing a lot by then. It was astonishing. It was like we were on the moon. It was not a sound, just dead quiet. A few donkey-drawn wagons in the streets, but that was it. Everything was dead still. I went to our headquarters, not too far from Tiananmen Square in the hotel, and they all said, we don't know, what we're going to be able to do, how we're going to do it. And while we're sitting there, all of a sudden China television comes on, and it's the Politburo. And it's Deng Xiaoping, and he's cracking down on China. And it was the first announcement of what they were going to do. And they had the martial music and the whole thing. So we had something to go on that night. And the next day, I could go peek into Tiananmen Square, but you couldn't really, as an outsider, walk through it or anything. So the fabled Gordon Manning was with us. And once again, he said, I think we can get a camera and put it on a bicycle. And Tony Wasserman was his ace cameraman that we had from South Africa, who had the same idea at the same time. And so we got a little cardboard box, took a little Super 8 camera, put it on the side in the back, the little pinhole thing, and got the lens right up against it. And then Tony and I did a bicycle tour of Tiananmen Square.
Riding bicycle.
Riding the bike. I'm riding a bike behind him, a flying pigeon, they were called. And I was just, like a tourist, saying, you can see that there are troops out here in front of Mao, in front of the tomb of Mao, and now we're going to a more commercial district. And then one guy slipped up behind us, a Chinese bicyclist, reached into the hole and tickled the lens and then drove away. But nobody else caught it. We were driving by, we knew later that the guards that were posted there were from the country. They were rural. That's why Tiananmen Square blew up. They had no sympathy for the university kids who were protesting. They were military guys, and they were everywhere. So we got all that and put it on the air, and I made a big hit in this country, Tom Brokaw's bicycle tour of Tiananmen Square.
Let's go to what I think you've called the most challenging story of your career, 9/11. Talk to us about where you were and what it was like covering that story, which really is one of the epic stories of...
Well, I remember exactly where I was. I had just come back from Montana, and I'd spent part of the summer trying to decide whether I wanted to continue as a nightly news anchor. Was it time to step away and write more books and pursue interests that I had? The fall is a raiding season, but it's also the best time to go steelhead fishing, and it's the hunting season, and I wanted to do some of that. So I came back, and Meredith stayed in Montana, and she had arranged for me to have a yoga lesson one morning, and the guy was a killer yoga guy, and so by 9 o'clock, I was, exhausted. And the phone rang, and it was the desk, and they said, small airplane has flown to the World Trade Center, maybe you ought to come in. So I turned on the television set, you could see the World Trade Center, and I, jumped into a suit and put on a tie and ran out into the street. It was election day in New York, and people were coming and going, and I said to one of my neighbors, have you heard what happened? He said, the election's not over. And I said, no, there's some plane is at the World Trade Center. I always remember that 3 blocks north of where we lived, a caravan of fire trucks were racing across Park Avenue to the west side. That fixed in my mind, but I didn't know at that point how serious it was. Got in a cab, and downtown, I listened to All News Radio, and a very good news radio reporter said, I was just in Washington Square, a plane flew over at low altitude, high speed, and flew into the second tower. And I instantly knew that we were under attack, and I called my wife in Montana and said, I don't know if we'll be able to talk again. I'm on my way to the office. Better turn on the television set. So I got to the office, ran down to the Today Show where Matt Lauer and Katie were on the air, and Tim was in Washington. And there were no big instructions. I sat down, and because I'd been the senior guy, on most stuff, I kind of gravitated to me, but it was seamless teamwork. Everybody was helping everybody else. We were all in tune with what we needed to do. And we were watching this, and we had just a flash of people jumping out of the Twin Trade Towers. That got on the air briefly, and then wisely everybody said, don't do that. We're not going to cover that way. But it's harrowing. I'll never forget the image of the woman I saw, who was fluttering her hands on the way down, and you wanted to throw up at that point. So we knew how serious it was. So we're dealing with all that, and then we hear they said, Jim Miklashevsky wants to come on the air. And he was at the Pentagon. He said, I don't want to panic anybody. We just heard a loud explosion on the other side of the Pentagon. I don't know what's going on, but that just happened. So now we know about the Pentagon going on. I'd grown up around construction. I wasn't an authority on it, but I knew enough about construction and stuff that was happening. And I was looking at those towers, the smoke coming out of them, and I said, those towers are going to have to be brought down. I thought, that they would have a controlled destruction of them. And then I thought, God, I shouldn't have said that. And just about then, they began to go down. And it was truly a heart-stopping moment. I don't mean that as a metaphor. It stopped all of us, and we watched that. And I came out of that, and I said, I don't have the exact language in my mind because I've never gone back and looked at it. A lot of people talk to me about it. I said, this will change us. We're at war. And from this moment on, we're going to be a different country, and we've been attacked on our soil. And one of my colleagues said, you also said this is the greatest attack on an American institution since the War of 1812, which it turned out it was. I remember that running through my mind. Has there ever been anything remotely like this? No. Pearl Harbor, Hawaii was not a state at that point, and it was a territory. So I said that. But I remember that what I said most of all is that it's going to change us. We're going to have to adapt, that we're now in a war against an enemy from the Middle East who use unconventional enterprises. A lot of people, my friends among them, said to me, I needed to hear that. I needed to make a transition in my own mind about what we were in for here. So then it went on for the rest of the day, and I have kind of an Irish low point for emotion. I kind of weep easily about stuff that moved me, and my mother was a Connolly, and I've always attributed to her background anyhow. I was doing fine. I was worried about breaking down at some point because the stuff was so overwhelming that we were seeing the pathos of it all. And we put a guy on the air who was describing what happened to him. He said he'd gotten to the bank of elevators and knew that probably couldn't get down, so he started on the stairs. He had 3 colleagues in wheelchairs waiting for the elevators to arrive, and of course they never did. And I spend a lot of time with people who are immobilized by climbing accidents or football accidents or whatever, confined to wheelchairs. And that was the most difficult moment for me. I then passed it off to another correspondent, and I had to collect myself. Went home that night, and we lived up on Park Avenue in an apartment that looked south, and we were up high enough that I could see the glow down there, and I had a big Irish whiskey and water, a big one. It went straight to me. It had no impact on me at all. And I thought, if I have another one, I won't be. So I went to sleep and woke up very early the next morning. And it turns out a very, very dear friend had died, coincidentally, that same night of lung cancer. And I was called about it. And I just cried for a half an hour about her and about all that we'd been through, and went back to the office.
Let me switch for a moment and go away from events and talk about some of your mentors. And you mentioned earlier how David Brinkley, for example, was a role model and a mentor for you in terms of how to be a correspondent, how to write. Could you talk about David and perhaps any other mentors you had?
Well, I grew up, I'm a child of television. I mean, I didn't see it until I was 15. We lived in such a remote area of South Dakota, we couldn't get a signal. So when I was 15 and moved to Yankton, I could see this new show called Huntley Brinkley, 15 minutes. And I could see Dave Garroway in the morning, and I could see Walter Cronkite on Sundays, and you were there. And for someone who had a curiosity about the world, it was transformative for me. I just couldn't get enough of it. And David, I always thought, was a genius at the marrying of what you were seeing on the screen and verbal description. He just didn't tell you what you were seeing. You know, the red car is taking over the black car. He didn't say that. He gave it a narrative. He gave it a way of describing not just what was obvious to you, but the meaning of it and putting it in context. There are lots of examples. I said one the other day about him talking about it. When Bobby Kennedy was killed. Did I tell that story or not? No. When Bobby Kennedy was killed in Los Angeles, there was a motorcade from the hospital to the airport. It went down the Santa Monica Freeway. And we had that picture up, and everybody was saying, well, there's a motorcade. She's in the second car. He's in the... David looked at it and didn't say anything until he said, for the second time in 5 years, a Kennedy widow is in a limousine behind a hearse carrying her husband's body to a Western airport for a flight to the nation's capital so the mourning can begin. Stopped. That's all you needed to hear. It was so brilliant, and the viewer were then left with the relevant information and their own emotions. There were some funny things he did as well. At one of the Republican conventions, Nixon and Goldwater and Goldwater and Nelson Rockefeller entered the convention hall together. They were trying to show the unified party. David let that play out for a while, and then he said, if that isn't love, it's going to have to do until the real thing comes along. That's all you needed to know. You didn't need to be told it's Goldwater walking with his enemy or anything like that. And so I was a student of David's in terms of trying to marry words with images so that they didn't bump into each other. So they complemented one another. He was a brilliant writer. He was also a great student of American history. His son became one of the great professors of American history. And I, when we worked together on the conventions, for example, I listened very carefully to what he was saying before he came to me so I could play off from it. One of my other favorite ones was that the night that Ronald Reagan was elected in 1980, David had had a gallbladder operation, so he was not able to be on the set all night long. And they're going to bring him in toward the end. And in those days, we had the colors right. Blue was for the Republicans, blue stockings. Red was for the Democrats, the color of protest. And the map in America was blue from the Northeast all the way to the West Coast. So David comes and sits down quite gingerly because he'd been in the hospital a few hours before, and John Chancellor said to him, David, what do you make of all this? David turned around very slowly and he said, it reminds me of a California swimming pool. That's all you needed to hear, frankly.
Adjust your tie for a second. Just came undone a little.
Oh, here we go again.
There
All
you
right.
go.
That's a nice tie. Boy.
How are we doing on time here?
Do you need to take a break at all, or are you okay with time?
We're-
We've probably about another hour. About 40 minutes to an hour.
Yeah, give me an idea of what you think, how much longer.
I think we're going to talk about the cut ahead, go ahead, cut, the profession.